Hello, traveler. Have you ever experienced that unsettling feeling that just shows up out of nowhere? An anxiety you can't quite explain, a fear that doesn't match your personal history, an emotional discomfort that seems to have no clear origin. Sometimes it is like we're carrying a weight that doesn't actually belong to our own life, like we're holding something that isn't ours, but somehow feels deeply, painfully familiar. And that is when the question arises, the question that so many people have been asking themselves: what if this didn't start with me? What if the pain I am feeling, the patterns I am repeating, the fears that grip me in the middle of the night, what if they didn't originate in my own experience at all? And that brings us to today's lesson. I want to introduce you to a perspective that could transform your relationship with your emotions, and maybe even change the way you see your family and yourself. We're going to explore how certain unresolved family traumas can infiltrate our behavior, our fears, our relationships, and even our life choices. How painful situations experienced by our parents, our grandparents, and even our great-grandparents can echo within us decades later, even when nobody talks about it, even when the original events are buried deep in family silence. The book, It Didn't Start With You, by therapist Mark Woolen, dives deep into this territory. And the fundamental idea is this: emotional cycles repeat themselves when they're not understood. Many of the feelings we consider our own might actually be inherited responses to traumatic experiences lived by other people in our family line, people we may never have met, people whose stories were never told. And this isn't mystical thinking or fantasy. This is epigenetics, neuroscience, and clinical psychology, because studies show that intense events, wars, abuse, unexpected losses, extreme poverty, profound rejection, and even experiences of forced migration, these can leave marks that transmit biologically and emotionally to subsequent generations. It is as if unresolved pain searches for a place to emerge, to be seen, to be acknowledged. And many times, so many times, it emerges in us, in our insecurities, in our compulsions, in our emotional blocks, in our explosions of feeling that seem disproportionate to what is actually happening, in our difficulties with connection and intimacy. Now, this understanding doesn't remove our responsibility for our own lives. It doesn't give us an excuse to stay stuck. What it offers instead is a context that can be profoundly liberating, because when you understand that some of your struggles aren't actually about you, when you can see the broader pattern, suddenly there is room to make different choices, room to break free from patterns you never chose in the first place. So how exactly do traumas cross generations? Mark Woolen details several different pathways. Some traumas are transmitted through emotional and behavioral patterns. For example, a father who grew up in an environment of fear and constant vigilance teaches his children to protect themselves even when there is no real danger present. The hypervigilance becomes the default setting, passed down like a family heirloom nobody asked for. Other traumas are carried through silences, through what the family doesn't talk about, what gets hidden, what becomes taboo. These silences create genuine emotional ghosts that haunt generation. They create these unspoken rules, these invisible boundaries, these topics that everyone knows not to bring up, even though nobody ever explicitly said so. And then there is unconscious identification. This is when a descendant, without realizing it, repeats the destiny of an ancestor, the son who lives the same type of relationship his grandmother did, the granddaughter who repeats her mother's pattern of abandonment, the great-grandson who carries guilt for something he doesn't even know happened, all of it operating stealthily in the unconscious mind, pulling strings the person can't even see. And finally, there is the epigenetic dimension of trauma transmission. This shows how traumatic experiences can modify patterns of genetic expression, patterns that get passed down to future generations, affecting how they deal with stress and emotions at a biological level. It is not that the trauma itself is encoded in DNA, but the way the body responds to stress can be altered and transmitted. All these mechanisms combined create an emotional terrain that makes us more predisposed to experiencing negative emotions, to anxiety, to depression, to feeling like something's wrong, even when everything looks fine on the surface. One of the most fascinating contributions of the book is the concept of core language. These are those deep internal phrases that emerge spontaneously when we're vulnerable, phrases that seem to come from a very ancient place inside us, and according to Mark Woolen, many times they really do come from that ancient place. They don't come from our personal history, they come from our family's emotional history. Phrases like, "I don't deserve happiness," "I'll always lose the people I love," "It is dangerous to trust others," "I have to be strong alone," "If I relax, something bad will happen to me." These phrases function like little beacons pointing toward ancestral patterns, and Woolen shows that by exploring these phrases, by tracing them back to their origins, we can identify the emotional roots of fears and blocks that seemed completely inexplicable until that moment. And from there, we can begin to untangle the knots that bind us to a past lived by our family members, a past that was never ours to carry in the first place. Now, the path the book proposes for healing isn't magical. It is not instantaneous, but it is profoundly transformative, deeply, fundamentally transformative, and it all begins with a process of emotional and historical investigation. One of the main tools is the genogram. This is a type of expanded family tree that records not just who is who in your family, but also the significant events that happened: sudden deaths, illnesses, losses, heart attacks, broken relationships, situations of violence, immigration, adoption, rejection, disappearances, all of it mapped out so you can see the patterns. From there, Woolen encourages people to pay attention to details, phrases that repeat across generations, behavioral patterns that show up again and again, dates that coincide in eerie ways, symptoms that arise without medical explanation, stories that nobody likes to tell, and even secrets that seem to hover in the air like unacknowledged ghosts. And when we manage to connect these clues, when we start seeing the pattern, often we realize that a pain that seemed irrational, inexplicable, suddenly starts making sense, and when suffering gains context, it loses some of its power, the mystery dissolves, the confusion clears, and in that clarity, there is space for healing. The author describes 3 essential stages of healing. The first stage is discovery, investigating with honesty and curiosity the history of your family, not to judge, not to blame, but to understand, to see what really happened instead of the sanitized version or the silent version. The second stage is recognition, giving a name to the inherited pain, acknowledging that it existed and that it affected everyone, bringing it into the light instead of keeping it buried in shadow. The third stage is integration, creating new emotional responses, new narratives, new choices that free the current generation from the ancient weight. And this integration doesn't require forgetting or blaming the past. It requires honoring and respecting that past so it can finally rest, so the weight can be set down at last. And what is really powerful is that the book is filled with real stories from real people who carried symptoms that seemed to make no sense: panic attacks, deep fears, self-sabotaging behaviors, constant feelings of inadequacy. And in many of these cases, healing began precisely when a puzzle piece from the past was discovered. Let me give you some examples. People who had an extreme fear of losing their parents, only to discover that in the previous generation, there was a tragic loss in the family. A person with persistent depression who was unconsciously carrying the pain of a family member who experienced profound grief in their time. People who repeated destructive relationships because they were identified with old stories of abandonment that weren't even theirs. The central point of these accounts isn't to dramatize family suffering. It is to show how knowing the origin of certain pains gives a person a sense of order, of clarity, and even of relief. It is that moment when everything clicks and you think, "Oh, this makes sense now. This finally makes sense." So what is the most important lesson from this book? Well, in the end, Mark Woolen reinforces something essential. Understanding family history isn't about placing blame on anyone. Not at all. Our ancestors did the best they could with the resources they had. They survived. They endured. They passed down life itself, even if they couldn't always pass down healing. The true invitation of the book is for us to see what was never seen, to name what remained hidden, to free what was trapped between generations. Because we are not prisoners of the past. We are inheritors of stories, some painful, others full of strength. And when we recognize this, when we truly understand it, we gain the chance to transform our lives and break cycles that have lasted for decades. So if you feel like you are carrying emotions you can't explain, maybe this is a good moment to look with compassion at your family history, because sometimes we spend years trying to fix something that didn't even originate in us. It was born in someone who came before, someone who perhaps suffered in silence, someone who never had the opportunity to process their pain, to speak their truth, to heal their wounds. And here is what is really beautiful about this work. The book doesn't just bring theory, it brings a practical human and compassionate path for healing what we're not to blame for carrying. It shows that yes, it is possible to recognize pain without becoming confused with it, to honor what came before without repeating the same patterns, and above all, to build an emotional life that is lighter and more authentic. Because when you understand that you are not broken, that you are not fundamentally flawed, that you are just carrying something that was never yours to begin with, that changes everything, that opens up possibilities that weren't visible before, that gives you permission to set down the weight and walk forward differently. The work of breaking intergenerational patterns isn't easy. It requires courage to look at what your family couldn't or wouldn't look at. It requires honesty to acknowledge painful truths. It requires compassion for the people who came before you and did their best with what they had. And it requires commitment to being the one who breaks the cycle, who stops the transmission, who says, "This pattern ends with me." But the freedom that comes from that work, the lightness of no longer carrying burdens that were never yours, the clarity of understanding why you react the way you do, why certain situations trigger you, why certain patterns keep repeating, that is invaluable. That is life-changing. Because once you see the pattern, once you understand the origin, you can make different choices. You can respond instead of react. You can create new patterns instead of unconsciously repeating old ones. You can be the ancestor your future descendants will thank instead of the one they'll need to heal from. And maybe that is the deepest gift this understanding offers. Not just healing for yourself, but healing that ripples forward into future generations. When you break a cycle, you don't just free yourself. You free everyone who comes after you. You give them the gift of not having to carry what you learned to set down. Stay safe, traveler. I'll see you on our next journey.